Welcome, guys, to my video on ELO and MMR, and there is a reason I'm making this video, and that reason is my number one pet peeve. My number one pet peeve is when I go on to places like the League of Legends Wild Rift subreddit, and every single day there is a post complaining that someone can't climb because Riot is giving them really bad teammates, and therefore the matchmaker is broken, and therefore that's the reason that they aren't challenger. That is my number one pet peeve, because it is not true. Like, categorically just not true. I made a post talking about how matchmaker is supposed to work, and I got called a Riot shill. I got asked how much I was paid to write this Reddit post, and it just baffles me at the delusion of a small but relatively vocal part of our player base is just constantly bashing the matchmaker. Don't get me wrong, the matchmaker is not perfect, but there is good reasons why the matchmaker is not perfect, because as I'll go into later into the video, there are lots of variables that Riot's numbers literally just can't predict, and therefore they give you the best kind of on paper scenario, but as we all know, most games of Wild Rift very rarely go to the on paper scenario. So I want to talk a little bit in this video about how ELO works, which is the system that the MMR system is basically based off, how MMR system is supposed to work, and then also talking about those variables and why, even when the Riot matchmaker thinks that it has given you a balanced game, is it often not the case. And that's based on a number of variables that we'll discuss and talk about why they influence your perception of matchmaking rather than the actual matchmaking being broken itself. Accidentally started streaming this video to my Twitch channel, so there's like 40 seconds of this video now randomly on Twitch, which is just about to get into this section. The number one video that has been linked to me on matchmaking is this one here, and this is one to argue that Riot are a little more nefarious with their matchmaking than they would let you believe. This is by a very handsome, very intelligent guy called Scooch. I'd recommend that you go and watch the video because it is actually very interesting. But essentially it talks about a leaked matchmaking algorithm that was one of EA's matchmaking algorithms for a 1v1 sports game. This paper essentially found that certain outcomes, certain win-loss draw outcomes, reduced the risk of the player quitting the game and not coming back to it for a while. That risk is called churn, and it essentially is the reduced churn risk based on certain win-loss outcomes. It found that if you draw lost one, lost one, lost draw one, or drew, your churn risk was lower than if you just straight up won 3 in a row. And so the argument was made that actually there is some elements of matchmaker that may be trying to force you into certain wins and losses or certain outcomes in order to keep you more engaged with the game in the long term. I actually think that particular argument does make sense. Clearly, from this particular paper, they found that these were the outcomes, and therefore, you know, there is some evidence to say that games are maybe less interested in matchmaking you fairly and more interested in matchmaking you to keep you engaged with the game for long periods of time. However, this was from a 1v1 sports game. It is much easier for a matchmaker to correctly predict the outcome of a match in a 1v1 sports game because the only skill that matters is the player on one side and the player on the other side. And the matchmaker will collect a load of data. So let's say we've got Jimmy John here on one side, and Jimmy John, they need to force him to lose because that's going to increase his chances of staying engaged with the game, right? So Jimmy John, they know that he's got a certain number. That's his ELO, or that's his sort of skill tier, and they know that if more likely than not, on the previous occasions that Jimmy has matched into a player that's like, let's say, an arbitrary 200 ahead of him, he loses 85% of the time. So they're like, okay, for this matchup, we're going to get Jimmy to go into a 200 against ahead of him because we know that he loses 85% of the time. Therefore, it's much more likely that we can correctly predict the outcome of this match. That's all very well and good for a 1v1 sports game because there are less variables to be concerned about. The only variables that you really have to worry about are maybe how the player is feeling on the day and maybe some of their previous wins and losses in that particular stretch. For Riot, for Wild Rift, it's different because there are 5 players that you have to be concerned about with different roles, different champions, different matchups, different potential skill entering that game, or maybe just in terms of like how well they're actually playing when they enter the game. There are loads of different variables, which I will discuss a little bit later on, and therefore it's nigh on impossible for Riot to correctly predict the outcome of a game, and therefore it benefits them to just slap people together who they believe are evenly matched, because they can never really get into the nitty-gritty of the really individual elements that potentially can influence the outcome. When Riot matches you together, they obviously have data based on your favorite champions, your preferred roles, etc. But let's say one game you just randomly decide to try another role, or you randomly try a new champion. The matchmaker can't predict that. It's already matched you together at that point. You're in Champion Select. Once you're in Champion Select, that is the matchmaker's job done. It has no influence beyond getting you into Champion Select with these other players. So then you just, you're a Xayah one trick and you decide to lock in Ezreal for no apparent reason other than you're just bored of playing Xayah. You're clearly going to be 10 times worse. And so therefore the matchmaker can never predict that, because it doesn't have any data to suggest that you're not going to play Xayah, because you've played Xayah in 95% of your games. So it's very difficult for the matchmaker to get things correct. And as I said, we're going to talk about that later on in the video. Now let's talk about ELO though, and how that applies to matchmaking rating. The ELO system was originally developed for chess, and it was a simple numerical system that used a formula to calculate the odds of winning in any 1v1 scenario. It was a relatively simple formula to do. You just needed to have two inputs, and the outcome would be EA, which is essentially the percentage chance of player A winning this match based on the two ELO numerical values for the two players. It was very simple. And it was a really, really good way of essentially giving you what the system predicted your percentage chance of winning this particular match would be. It was a very easy system to implement for a 1v1 scenario. And whilst that ELO system was very good at predicting 1v1 outcomes, of course, as games evolved, the need for a team-based MMR or matchmaking system became apparent. And that's what the Wild Rift MMR system is. It is a team-based number system that is designed to create two teams of 5 that have very balanced team MMRs. To get a team MMR, it will take all of your individual MMRs, it will plug it into whichever formula it uses to calculate a team MMR, and it will match 5 players and 5 players together in the exact format that allows the two teams to be as balanced as possible on a numbers basis. And that's important to remember. The matchmaking system, all it's doing is it's taking your numerical MMR value, plugging it into the matchmaking system, finding 9 players that are as close to you as possible in terms of relative MMR rating, and balancing two teams so that the overall team values are as equal as possible. Now, discussions can be raised as to whether that is the best way to match people, whether this MMR system itself is the best way to match people together. But as of yet, there isn't really a better way to do this. And of course, as I've mentioned, there are plenty of other non-quantifiable things that influence how a match feels that the MMR system just can't predict. It's not that the Riot number MMR system or the matchmaking is letting you down. It's more that there isn't a very good way to accurately predict how players are going to behave in a system where there are so many variables. And that's the problem. There isn't a good way to answer this question, because there isn't really an answer for this question, and the MMR system is just the best guess that Riot has at assessing your skill level. Over time, this entire system is designed to get you to the rank that you're supposed to be, but some people may just take more games to get there than others, just through the very nature of how individual player behavior has so much weight on the outcome of a game. Riot does not match you with people who are AFK because they have to be there to accept the match in the first game, or they don't match you with trolls. People may just go into a game and decide they've had enough and decide to troll. People might be choosing a new champion for the first time. People might get shoved into a really bad matchup. And these are things the matchmaker cannot predict. There is no way that a numerical matchmaker system can suddenly say, oh, well, this Yasuo one trick is going to randomly play Irelia, but he's going to play it into, I don't know, Darius in the top lane, and he's going to go 0-10. Like, how can a numerical matchmaker system accurately predict that? It can't. There is no way. I mean, if we could accurately predict player behavior at that kind of level, Riot would be selling that for millions. That's technology that just isn't quite there yet. And so right now, this matchmaker system based on a number that is reflective on wins and losses is really the most accurate way that Riot has at pairing people together. And if you have a more accurate way, can predict player behavior, can predict champion choices, that can predict lane matchups, that can predict if there's someone's just deciding to have an off day, then feel free to float that technology out there, because my God, you're going to be a millionaire. And this article here, which I think is really good, and I'm going to link it in the description below, it's an article for League PC, but the same concepts still apply to the Wild Rift Matchmaker. Talks about why sometimes matches might not feel very balanced. Sometimes when you're playing during low activity times of day, of course, the Riot Matchmaker wants to balance queue time with fairness of match. And as the queue times expand, it's going to expand the values of MMRs that it feels acceptable to lock together to form a match. Parties of players with very different MMRs. We all know the player that's like Diamond, that's queuing with an Emerald 5. That's going to have some very different MMR values, which is going to make it even more difficult for the Riot Matchmaker to really get those matchups correct. A shortage of one or more positions. If there are no jungle players queuing, someone is going to get auto-filled into a jungle role, which is going to make them feel very uncomfortable and, of course, not let them play at their respective skill level. And, of course, there is things that then also influence the perception of a fair match. One or more player trying an off position. One or more players trying an unfamiliar champion. We've talked about some of those concepts already. An otherwise fair match in which one lane has an unfair matchup. Again, the Riot Matchmaker will not predict lane matchups. The matchmaker gets you to champion select, and after champion select, it's down to the players. That's why there are big player-driven choices and player-driven influences that the matchmaker has absolutely zero influence in. The matchmaker may be able to predict, oh, well, this guy's a Yasuo one-trick mid lane, so we're going to put him in the mid lane where he can play Yasuo. But they are no way going to say, they are no way going to sort through loads of different other mid laners on the enemy team and say, well, let's get him a good matchup. Let's find someone that's like a Corki one-trick so that the Yasuo can get a good matchup. That's just not going to happen. It will find a mid laner that's of equal skill. They probably won't really even take into account, or at least it won't be a huge influence, the types of champions that these guys play. So the matchmaker is never going to predict lane matchups. And of course, as we know in League of Legends, lane matchups are incredibly important to outcomes, as are team comps. How is the matchmaker supposed to predict team comps? It can't. And so there are just player-driven choices that massively influence how a game is that the matchmaker has no influence in. Games can snowball with assassins. Let's say you have someone that just makes a couple of mistakes in lane. Suddenly the Z is 3-0 with Serralda's Grudge at 5 minutes. How is the matchmaker going to predict that? And sometimes, as I always say, players just have bad games. It is what it is. Sometimes, as you may have noticed, the visual skill tier doesn't quite match up to where it should do. Sometimes when you're winning a lot of games, the matchmaker is going to pit you against stronger opponents. If you're winning a lot in a row, the matchmaker's suddenly going to think, well, this guy's clearly too good for silver. Let's start putting him in gold, where the matchmaking rating is similar. And so if you're in Silver 3 and suddenly getting shoved in with a load of gold players, it's because the matchmaker thinks that you're good enough to be there. And of course, if you start losing, it then may readjust and put you back down to where it thinks you'll be in the end. It's the same reason as the other way. If you're losing a load of games and you're Diamond, and let's say you went from Diamond 3 to Diamond 4, you've lost 10 games in a row, suddenly it's going to think, well, was Diamond the right rank for this guy? And, you know, the MMR will have dropped and suddenly you'll start playing against Emeralds. That's just how it is. It's very, very important to know that the background MMR rating is not directly associated with your visual tier. Your visual tier is loosely associated to your overall MMR rating. And of course, the MMR system is designed to get you to the visual skill tier that the rest of the people who have a similar MMR to you are currently sat at. The whole point of the MMR system is that it's supposed to get you to where you want to go, but it may just take longer to get there. But what I really wanted to get at with this video is that the MMR system is based on numbers. Those numbers are very largely based on the numbers of wins and losses you've got. There may be other factors that go into determining your MMR, but realistically, the majority of it comes on the numbers of wins and losses that you've got compared to the relative skill level of the other teams that you've faced. And then once you get into champion select, everything from there, the matchmaker says, Jesus, take the wheel. It is not influencing the picks that your team gets. It's not influencing the picks that your other team gets. It's not influencing how your teams play in game. And of course, with League of Legends, there is no real good way, or Wild Rift, there's no real good way to accurately assess a player's macro knowledge, a player's matchup knowledge, a player's ability to know when their power spikes are, whether they know the right itemization. It does not know that. It can't know that. And if it did, it'd be the most advanced matchmaking system in the world. The matchmaking system is just supposed to give you a general idea of the skill, but because of how complex this game is and how many player-led decisions go into the outcome of a game, the matchmaking system is never going to have a perfect way of matching the most ultimately evenly skilled players together. It just isn't. It does its best. And I think in general, if you've got a better way, you'd be a millionaire, because right now this is the best we've got. So I wanted to kind of go into depth and explain how it works in a bit more detail, and also some of the factors that go into it, because I think it's important. Like, my number one gripe, as I said at the start of the video, is when people blame the matchmaker for holding them back. No. There are multiple things that you can do outside of the matchmaking to make you a better player. And yes, sometimes there will be games that you cannot do anything about. I'm not going to dispute that. I've had those games myself. But let's say you play 200 games. Over the course of those 200 games, better players will win more. That is just how it is. So there are always things that you can do over the course of several games to try and improve, focusing on yourself so that by the time that you get to your 50th game, you're a better player than you were at your first. If you're constantly blaming matchmaker and not focusing on improving yourself, by the time that you get to your 50th game, you'll be exactly the same as you were when you started, which is why you're not climbing, which is why you're constantly getting more and more frustrated in this cycle of hate towards your teammates, when really the players that actually spent 50 games improving have already climbed the rank ladder. And again, the number one argument that you can give to anybody when it comes to talking about the matchmaker is, how can you explain good players that climb? They weren't held back. They weren't held back by the matchmaker. They weren't given special dispensation. Riot have not selected a random 200 accounts that they want to give special dispensation to get Challenger. No, those players are just better than you, and they're better than me. And the only way that you ever reach that level is by practicing and getting better and being more of a direct influence on the outcome of your game. Because as I've clearly said, and we've clearly talked about, player-led decision-making has a huge influence in the outcome of a game, and the matchmaker can only get you so far. So just be aware of that when we're talking about matchmaking, and I hope it helps you understand a little bit more about some of the complexities of matchmaking in a game like Wild Rift. It's very difficult to do, and I'm hoping it kind of helped focus your mind sometimes on what is important, which is about how you're playing.